Good afternoon. I'm Dan Bates, President and CEO of the Greater Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, and you are joining us in the conversation. Today, our guest is Denise Quinn, retired senior executive for manufacturing, many years of experience, also very involved in her community. She's on the Boys and Girls Club on the board. She's also Port Authority board and also on the board of Fort Hamilton Hospital Foundation. So we are thrilled to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us. In just a moment, Byron Skaggs will be joining us. And he will be facilitating the conversation about the book, To Sell is Human. So hold on for a great conversation. And with that, Byron, it's up to you.
Thanks, Dan. And appreciate the opportunity to come and be a part of the conversation again and to help facilitate this conversation with Denise and to talk about a great book that really kind of turns the idea of sales on its head a little bit, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes. But I wanted to get into a couple housekeeping things before we get into the book, and so I just wanted to make a note. And I figured I'll advertise. We've always talked about this at the end of every session. I'm going to talk about it at the beginning, and then I'll bring it back around at the end. But the next conversation in September, we will be exploring the idea of customer service and using the book Uncommon Service. And so be sure to watch for that, sign up, register for Uncommon Service, which will be the next conversation in September. And also, just wanted to mention, if you're online and you're a part of the event, I don't know if you may have logged in anonymously. We would love to get some sort of connection to you, just so we can be able to share back and forth. So if you can share your email with us or tell us who you are. And we have Tiffany with us here, and she's helping to facilitate the online conversations. And so we will have both live interaction with our audience here as well as our audience online. So if you have questions, please feed those into the comment section, and we can have those bits come into our conversation here. And we would love for this to be for all of us to be able to engage and have that conversation together. So this is an interactive thing where we're encouraging you to ask questions or to make comments and to help feed the whole conversation forward. So as we prepare for this, let me just ask that you take a minute and think about the topic of sales today, the topic that we'll be looking at. And I want you to just think about it on a scale of 1 to 10. How engaged do you want to be with this conversation? From 1 being not engaged at all, I'm just doing this to try to maybe, well, I don't know why you would say 1, but if you do say 1, that's okay. Because the other option would be very engaged at a 10. So somewhere along that spectrum, what do you expect your engagement to be during this time? And just take that little number down and write that at the top corner of a piece of paper, or just think about that for a second. Because my next question is this, or statement rather, is to take a minute and prepare your environment to allow you to meet that expectation, to be engaged in the level of engagement that you want to have in your environment. Prepare yourself, whether that's turning off your phone, flipping something over, just kind of clearing everything out so you can actually meet that level of engagement that you want to have. Okay, I think that's everything. Denise, thank you. I really appreciate your willingness to come and be a part of the conversation today. And the book, do we have the book over here? It's Daniel Pink's To Sell is Human.
So mine has a few markers in it. There it is.
That's astounding.
Yeah.
So let me begin by just asking you the question. This may not seem like it fits anywhere in the conversation, but okay. when you were a child, what did you want to become as an adult?
Yeah, I'm not sure that does fit. I'm going to say it because I thought as a child that I wanted to go into healthcare. Well, maybe it does fit, admin. So I thought I wanted to go into healthcare, and actually pursued a biology degree in college. So I took it further than just childhood, thinking that that was the direction that I wanted to go. However, once I got into college, I realized that sciences weren't necessarily my best subjects, and perhaps what I wanted to do and what I should be doing were somehow different. I stayed on the path and got my biology degree, but I think ultimately when I get into the workforce is when I found out what I really wanted to do. And so what I wanted to be and what I ultimately became, two very different things. Or what I thought I wanted to be. Let's go with that.
Sure.
And what I ultimately became were two very different things.
Sure. So to extend that question a little bit further, you have recently retired.
Yeah.
So tell us about your career path, because then I have a follow-up question to this, but I want to hear your journey from college then to your recent retirement.
So I was fairly fortunate that the college that I went to, an organization did on-site interviews. Shameless plug, it was Miller Brewing Company at the time, and they were looking for, you had to have a science degree in order to get into their entry-level quality. So although sciences perhaps weren't my best grades in college, it was the entry for me to actually have the conversation with the interviewer. So I interviewed. I got a second interview out at the brewery that was nearby, and I didn't hear from them again. And so that was a little disappointing, but less than 3 weeks later, I heard from the other division, the container division. So I actually started my career doing quality checks on empty 12-ounce aluminum cans.
Wow.
And so I started out in the quality department, and every couple of years with the organization, I got the opportunity to try something different. And that's really where this book starts to come into play, right?
Okay.
So I was in the quality department and had an opportunity to go into a program that would allow me to work in what was then considered the other side, the dark side, production. And I got into the production department, and that's where I really had greater interaction and ability to influence people. That really started to charge me up. And so I actually continued with the container division, moving into the production side of the business, having greater opportunity to work directly with the people, having more impact on people, because that's really what drove me. And then got the opportunity ultimately to come to Ohio, to a brewery. That was my first opportunity when they started the facility here. Then traveled to the state of Washington, state of Texas, back to Ohio. And every couple of years got the opportunity to do something different, ultimately becoming a vice president of the organization, plant manager in Washington, Texas, and Ohio. But when people would say, what is it you really want to do at work? It wasn't necessarily about being promoted. It was, where would I have the ability to have impact on more individuals and greater influence within the organization? And it didn't mean that I had to be promoted. So lateral moves for, plant manager in Washington, Texas, and Ohio, always learned something different, even though the title was the same.
Sure.
And so that's really what drove me, was that opportunity to influence and impact, which I found a lot of threads as I was reading this book.
Sure.
About how certainly I could have done some of that perhaps even better and differently, but certainly also things I could relate to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and that's part of the fun of doing this, is even as I was reading it, I recognized that there are moments where I'm going, my own ability to sell is being influenced by the things that I'm reading with this. It really kind of keeps hammering back. That's why I keep reading these books too, and I love to just then have these conversations.
The organization also,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you,
That's
but
right.
the organization also went through a time where it actually had a campaign called We All Sell Beer. So it was like, and I think a lot of people were kind of like, what do you mean? What does that mean? And so I think this actually could have been a very appropriate book for the organization at that time to give people a better understanding of what that can mean. That can mean, in personal interactions. It could certainly mean in a lot of professional settings, but it had gone through that whole, and it's still today, part of the organization where it is all of our responsibilities, to your point, that we are salespeople.
Yeah. So, and this is just a follow-up question to this. It's not one that I gave you, so I hope you're okay with a curveball.
Okay.
And if you're not, tell me otherwise.
Okay.
But now that you're stepping into retirement, what do you want to become now?
So the interesting thing going into retirement is, if you don't know Vistaprint, right, you could do your own business card, right? So I had to decide what was I going to put on a business card, because I'd been in enough situations where people were asking for my contact information. So I do some stuff with the college that I went to. I do some leadership panels and things. And so I thought, well, what am I going to, I'm going to have to do a business card. So on the business card, I put retired manufacturing executive and community volunteer. And that's really where my energies, people say, wow, do you have a lot of time on your hands? And the answer is no. I think what happened was when I was working, it was, can you attend this? Can you do this? The answer was no, I'm working. And now it's, can you do this? Yeah, sure. Can you do this? Yeah, sure. And then I look at my calendar and I think, oh my God, what have I said yes to? But it's been really exciting, because I can dedicate more time to the community involvement work. So, you know, Dan mentioned the Boys and Girls Club. We've got a lot of things going on there. Port Authority, good news, very busy, right? Economic development driver. So that's been very busy. So now it's about impacting and influencing people, right? And others in a different way than what I did, right? Professionally.
Yeah. Well, and that's the premise of the book, is the idea that, like it or not, we are all in sales. The past construct of a salesperson as an actual title, literally, the studies have shown, and this is what Daniel Pink brings out in the book, is that 1 in 9 are technically sales positions. That's kind of across the board throughout the United States. But his argument really speaks to the fact that the other 8 out of the 9 individuals, the majority of them are also in sales. It may not necessarily be monetary sales, but it's the idea of trying to exchange something. It's the idea of trying to move somebody forward, or exchange time, or an activity, or a talent, something that is the process by which you are literally utilizing sales techniques in your own environment. It could be how you want to maybe motivate your son or daughter to do something at the house, or it could be, you know, motivating somebody to be involved in community volunteering and those kind of pieces. So that's really what we're speaking to. Is it's yes, it's sales, but it's the construct that we all end up being in sales, and it's, you know, the idea that we all sell beer with the movement there. I believe at one point in time, and I don't know if they've moved on to call them Apple Geniuses, but for a while, I believe they were called Mac Evangelists. And it was the idea that everybody, even if you were the person on the floor who's helping with, you know, technical speak or teaching somebody about something, it was still a sales type role. And so that's one of the things I'm curious about from your experience. I mean, you kind of spoke to this a little bit earlier, but do you agree with that premise that we are all in sales, whether we like it or not, and why or why not?
Yeah, I definitely agree with it. One of the reasons I actually wrote like notes on why did I like this book, you know, and some of it is that it was not only that it was relatable experiences that they talked about, but that I could actually identify a real life experience where it said, okay, there it is. Here's a technique I could have used that perhaps would have made me more successful, or wow, I remembered using that, but maybe had no idea why it did work.
Sure.
And so I also like that they gave you kind of the background of why some of these things work the way that they do. But certainly as I moved up in the management ranks, and by the way, I tend to make a distinction between managing and leading. I think this book has a lot to do about leading, right? That you flip that switch and you start to look at the importance of your ability to step into someone else's shoes, the importance of your ability to see their perspective and understand where they're coming from, your ability to then take that and make sure that's part of your thought process and part of your strategic planning even of how you're going to move the organization forward or deliver something you have to deliver because it's part of the larger organization.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of things in here that to me were extremely helpful. And it doesn't matter if it was, they certainly point out, it doesn't matter if it's a big organization or a small organization. I mean, some of the reason things are the way they are is because of small organizations and the successes that they delivered and really digging into how they delivered it. And so size of the organization doesn't matter, but I am a firm believer in the book. I, like I said, feel I've learned more, things that I can continue to use, but very definitely as I moved in the organization, a lot of my role and responsibility was about how do I move people, right? Because if I move the people, then I move the organization. And so a lot of what I did actually was about moving people.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, he makes the distinction in the book that a lot of times when people think sales, they immediately go to all of the negative aspects. A person who is kind of a duplicitous person, two totally different kinds of people. The whole concept of buyer beware, that it was an asymmetrical level of a relationship where and sometimes we even kind of cringe, and I see some nodding heads. The idea that we kind of cringe at this type of salesperson who seems fishy or smarmy, or they have knowledge and power that we don't as the buyer, and so there's that sense of being uncomfortable with the relationship because they know things that we don't, and that asymmetrical pattern is what Daniel is really trying to help us realize, that we don't even operate necessarily in a culture or in a marketplace or an environment anymore that really does that on a large scale anymore, because there's so much information. There are so many ways in which the consumer has access to information. It's becoming more and more the seller beware. Reviews. If somebody doesn't do something correctly and they get they somehow treat a customer wrong, all it takes is one bad review, right? Or maybe a series of bad reviews, and then all of a sudden that person no longer has a job as a salesman or saleswoman because they did something wrong to one specific person, or a restaurant, or I think of an Uber driver or whatever else. If one mistake and all of a sudden those rankings drop, so it becomes a seller beware. And so what Daniel is really trying to help us work toward is the idea of having some parity in those conversations, and really beginning to sit at a place of level conversation where the buying and selling process truly seeks to be more of a win-win. And it's a process of how can we do this in a way so that if we are the ones who want to move something or to sell something, how can we do it in a way that we both come away with a win in the conversation? And if we seek to win all the time, there's always going to be a loser, and that hurts more in the long run. And so, when we think about life and work, what's the greatest barrier that you've faced in the past with moving others?
There might have been a little bit of the win-win, certainly, and that's I thought of an example, what I thought was a really good example is that was discussed, and that was, instead of calling it win-win, it's the mutual gains, right?
Yeah. And
so, not surprising, within a large organization, there are negotiations that go on a regular basis. Some very official, like with a union, and certainly barriers there are a belief of who has more information, a belief about whether or not the full story is on the table. Certainly the relationships that have been built and whether they have been positive relationships that have been built. But I think anytime you go into a situation where there is a negotiation of some sort, because they can be this big and they can be this big, of any sort, I think that those kinds of things definitely are the toughest, and probably it's hit me with the most barriers to ensure that you're working that 365 days a year because that relationship is so important in that particular situation. I want to step back for a second.
Sure.
I thought what was pretty interesting too is you talked about the whole move from buyer beware to seller beware. That whole conversation in there about technology and the belief that technology was going to eliminate salespeople, right? That, oh my God, here it is. It's the last Fuller Brush man. I also thought that was interesting that he brought the last Fuller Brush man along for the ride. But I thought that whole discussion, because I think that's where everybody went, right? That, now we've got technology, we don't need the salesperson. The reality, as they did all the studies and all the statistics, is that it's the opposite, that it's actually increased sales. And that's both traditional sales and now, of course, all the non-sales selling jobs, which is certainly I'm in a non-sales selling job, or is. And so I thought that whole dynamic of this information flood that we have and what it allows us to do today, the infamous your iPhone is a mini computer. It doesn't matter where you go. If someone tells you something, my favorite thing I have a 23-year-old. So I'm constantly saying, yeah, we'll Google it. So we Google a lot, right? Because you can automatically get that information, and it is no longer that there is an information asymmetry. It is that everyone has the ability to have that same information. So I thought that whole dynamic of how we have, to some extent, all become non-sales selling people is also partially a component that was supposed to eliminate sales. Right. And so it's also an interesting dynamic.
Well, and then the challenge becomes curating the information.
Correct.
So that we're not just gathering all this information. It's what do we find that's quality information, and then beginning to how do we determine what is quality information? There become a whole number of other steps and stages to this that I think if we go back to those traditional salesperson type roles, all we had to go on was what they provided us.
Right.
And now you get just a wealth of information, some really good and some not so good, and then it becomes how do we curate that? And so and I appreciate your thought on this. I'm curious, from those here in the audience or people that are online, any other thoughts about what kind of barriers or what things have you seen that come in the way of this idea of helping to move people along a particular sales path, or that you just, if you want to motivate somebody to do something? Any thoughts?
I have.
Okay.
I have one. I think that, I had the opportunity to read the book, and I think that one of the big messages in it is something we all know to do that we never do. And that's spend much more time listening before we talk. And that's challenging, and he actually gave you some tools in the book. But even with the pitch and however you're going, whatever you're trying to move somebody to do something, if you don't take the time to understand where they are, what's going to resonate with them, that getting them to shift in the direction you want them to go in is going to be much more challenging.
Yeah.
And I know that's one of my personal challenges is listen first.
Listening first. You kind of hinted at it, but that notion of transparency. You said have a conversation with a union person who, whether you like it or not, they have certain beliefs, or you have certain beliefs about what's actually being put on the table, and what's being talked about is actually the issue at hand. So some of it is a question of transparency. That could be a barrier, that if you're not at a place where everybody around the table is willing to be transparent and kind of upfront, then that becomes a bit of a challenge. Especially if you're the one trying to move somebody forward, the more transparent you can be, I think the more effective this whole process becomes. Any other thoughts or comments about this idea of a potential barrier to moving others?
Well, I think sometimes there's a mindset, and it's very difficult to change that based on experience or lack thereof, that they have a definitive idea or perception about something, and so it's hard to change that.
Yeah. So even if you're coming with kind of an open mind to try to do something different, if somebody else is stuck with a set of expectations, that opens a whole other conversation Wow. Okay, my mind is like firing off. But this idea of how can we come to an agreement about how we will proceed with the conversation, this discussion of a particular piece, as opposed to just relying on and assuming expectations. Expectations will always leave somebody disappointed. But if you can come to us and say, I'd like to create an agreement with you, it kind of levels the playing field for some possible discussion back and forth. I see another hand. Yes.
Carol Lucio has a comment.
Okay.
She said, I think it's impossible to motivate someone else to do something. You can inspire or intrigue them, but they have to be motivated themselves. I agree with Dan. Listen more and then provide info options for them to take action.
Great. Thanks, Carol. That's from online. So,
yeah,
go ahead.
So, shameless plug for another book. There's a book called, everybody always talks about that you have to have these courageous conversations. So when you talk about, a person gets set and they have a particular mindset and how do you move them off that mindset? There's a book called Crucial Conversations.
Yes.
Right. And it actually lays out that when you've got a situation where opinions differ, that emotions may be high. So if I'm tied into my mindset, my emotions pretty heavy. Emotions heavy. And the third one is there's a lot at stake. And so it talks about, and what's great is, again, it's another one that can go for professional life or personal life. And it's great. It's an easy read. It's got great examples in it. But it really talks about the importance of the preparation. So to Dan's point about listening, in this book, it talks about not listening for anything. Isn't that what it was? It's basically that because of expectation of what you might hear, right? Don't go there. Be very open about the listening component. But what I like about Crucial Conversations is you start with what you don't want to happen. So you don't want to maybe lose trust in the relationship that you have. You don't want this to end up, in a bad place, whatever that might be. So you start with the premise of what you don't want to happen as a result of that conversation and then move towards what you do want to help happen. Not sure that it necessarily breaks the mindset. Listening to Carol and the motivating, whether or not you can motivate somebody versus inspiring or intriguing. I have an example, and I'm not sure where it would fall. And Carol, make sure you come back in and give me some feedback on this. We had a situation where we were trying to get everybody to really jump into sustainability components. So reuse, reduce, recycle. And we had identified an individual who was very passionate about it in the organization. And we gave them 5 years to get us to zero waste to landfill. He accomplished it in 23 months. But what I learned from him really came true in this book. And so as he was, first off, because I was the plant manager, I had to give up my garbage can first because he knew that you had to show that, everybody was bought into this and that everybody had to participate. And unless, she gets her garbage can back, you can't have one either. But the bigger thing that I learned from him was that, and this is where it goes, whether it was motivating or inspiring or intriguing the persons. He couldn't necessarily get people to move when he talked about why it was the right thing for them to do. But when he started to talk about what they could be leaving their kids or their grandkids, all of a sudden their whole mindset shifted. They started to get into, well, what do you mean? He was able to start explaining to him about some longer term effects of some of the things that were happening. And proud to say that this individual brought us to be the largest domestic brewer to go landfill free. 99.8% of all waste goes to reuse, reduce, recycle. But he couldn't get it until he could make that connection for people. Yes. And it wasn't about themselves, right? So serve and all those other things in the book. It was about their grandkids or their kids. And that's what ultimately, whether it's motivated or inspired them, I think that's a tough thing right there, to do the right thing. And ultimately, we achieved something as an organization we were very proud of. It went into sales. They began to use it in a campaign. And so, but it wasn't about themselves. It was when you tied it to someone else that was important to them, that it actually turned on the light for them, and we achieved what we needed to achieve.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because it is a, that is one of the frames that he uses in the book, that where you literally you talk about the possibilities of the future, what could be. That's a framing that he actually talks about in the book. And I wish we could actually hit on all of these pieces, but there is a portion of the book where he talks about different ways to frame a way to move people. And one of those ways to frame things was in the process of talking about possibilities and the framing of potential. Another example was a possibility or a framing of comparison, of looking at it as, and he used the example in the book of a homeless man who just had the sign, let's hold up this way, that just said, "I am blind." And they watched as people walked by and nobody did anything. And so then somebody else goes, "I think I have an idea. It's just going to be 4 simple words." And they took the sign and he wrote, "It's springtime." And he added that in front of that phrase, "It's springtime and I'm blind." And all of a sudden people realized there's a comparison in what he couldn't see, and they started giving. So there are ways to frame how you discuss things that could be a way to motivate or inspire somebody to do something, to move. It is a process of how do we do that. So some of it is a bit of an exploration even of thinking that process. So let me just throw this out as another question for all of us to think about, but Denise, for you to kind of lead the way in answering this one too, is just take a minute and think about a great sales experience that you've had, whether you were the salesperson or you were the potential buyer. Think about a great sales experience that you've had, and also think about one that was terrible. And what was the difference? What was the difference between those two?
So the great one is fairly recent for me. I have a niece, and it's the only niece on my side of the family. So she's kind of special to me, and so we made the decision that we were going to buy her a used car as her high school graduation on to college gift. She's a hard worker. I could give you tons of platitudes about her, but I won't. And so that experience was amazing, and I use it because it's a used car salesperson, but it's an organization up in upstate New York, and actually my husband and my niece had found the car while I was doing something else, and we went back to talk to them and finalize the deal and everything. It's an organization that is the no haggle kind of thing. So the price is the price. So you walk in, you tell them this is how much, that I want to spend and no more. And they call up every vehicle on their lot that would fit your criteria. So that whole thing in the book about that the computer is there for both of you to see. So the computer is there for both of you to see, the screen. And so you go through and then you pick out 7 to 10 vehicles that you want to go out and take a look at. And they went out and they took a look at some cars and they drove some cars and really keyed in on this one vehicle. But it wasn't only all of the work that this individual, and it was a saleswoman, but that the saleswoman did before we said yes to the vehicle, which was extraordinary. But it was also, I went back as we were signing checks and handing over money and doing all the final stuff. And I admit it, she shocked me, right? Because you think about the salesperson, a used car. And she said, "You know what?" She said, "This is your first car and it's your car." And she pointed to my niece. And she said, "So we're going to go through each one of these documents because I want to make sure you really understand what each one of these documents mean." And so she went through the lemon laws, and she went through, what she had to do relative to maintenance with the vehicle. She went through every single document that my niece had to sign to make sure that my niece understood everything. Anytime I need a used car, I'll probably drive to upstate New York to this woman in order to get a vehicle, because I felt that experience was, to me, it was extraordinary, right? You hope that that's what you have all the time. But to me, it felt extraordinary and oh, by the way, it was her vacation day.
Wow. She
came in on her vacation day because she knew this was my niece's first car. In order to sit down with her and go through very methodically,
Wow.
because you know how many papers you get that you have to sign. She went through each one of those documents. I could not say enough positives to her manager or to anyone else. I don't know that every other salesperson in their organization does it. Maybe it is. You know, we read a couple of examples that they talk about, dark cars and some other things, where these are the kinds of practices that they say are what they want to be about.
Yeah.
She definitely was a tremendous ambassador for herself, but also for that organization. I've gone back online to see what kind of vehicles they have that I might be interested in. But that was, to me, an incredible piece where she understood, right, my niece's perspective. First car, didn't know anything about any of this. She was now going to own the car, and it was all going to be her responsibility. So what did that look like? Probably she knew the excitement, you know, for getting her first car and all that. But then she took all that, and really what she delivered from a service perspective, to me, was just extraordinary, just extraordinary. So like I said, we'll probably go back. If you ever need a used car, let me know. I'll tell you where to go.
But that also speaks to what we mentioned earlier, the seller beware of a potential negative. The good experiences also get talked about. And so that becomes potential, you know, igniting of fans and people who just want to celebrate how somebody is doing something very, very well.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts or comments on, or an experience that you might want to share, either positive or negative? Okay.
You know, without getting into specific experience, I think, you know, what Denise just described and our experiences I've had, I just had a very negative experience yesterday with a company that shall remain nameless. But you know, it's all about whether it's about me or about them.
Yeah.
And when it's no longer about me, which is what happened yesterday, it was really what they were trying to get me to do. And so my question started out by me trying to lower one of my monthly bills. And, you know, it still kept coming back to, they were giving me this great deal, which was actually increasing my monthly bill. And it became, after an hour and a half, a little frustrating. So, you know, what Denise just described, I think the magic of that is, you know, that salesperson turned that experience all about her customer and made that a memorable experience for her niece that she'll probably never forget.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, she may never get that kind of attention again, but, you know, I mean, sad to say, but I mean, you know, she made that a teaching moment, and what a powerful thing to do for your first car purchase.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what's fascinating, and this is, I mean, because you both are speaking to something that I want to kind of step into, as well as what he writes about in the book is the age-old axiom for sales is ABCs of sales always be closing. And that push to always, you know, do something, to be closing, to be making that sale, to move. And he turns that on its head a little bit and says, I've got a new set of ABCs. And so the A is attunement. Attunement is the listening practice, the things that you were just talking about, finding a common ground, finding, you know, putting the saleswoman, putting herself in your niece's shoes to say, hey, this is fantastic, but I want to make sure that you fully understand everything. And there's an attunement process that, honestly, she'd already sold the car.
Right. Yeah.
She could have just walked away.
Yep.
But she took that extra time, and because there's that concept that it's not always just about this sale, there is a future potential that's there as well. So that attunement and listening. I'll get to the B and the C real quick. B was buoyancy, and C was clarity. And so we'll look at those here real quick as well. The buoyancy was, you know, how do you understand someone else's perspective? The buoyancy is how do you remain afloat in the ocean of rejection? Because rejection does happen with sales. Whether it's literally moving somebody or trying to sell a product or a service, you're going to get the no's. And then the premium skill of what happens with clarity. And so I want to kind of look at some of these real quick. The attunement aspect really gets down to, when you mentioned the listening, it is that idea of asking more questions, taking time to sit and reflect. One of the examples he used in the book was to go through the process of mirroring or mimicking somebody, and how do you do that so that it's not so that it's completely uncomfortable, but he actually did it through an improv class, which was where he kind of got the whole start of doing something just as somebody was, as if he was standing in or looking in a mirror. And then the other component to that was that conversation that went back and forth, but there was a 15-second pause in between to literally sit and think about what was actually being asked.
He actually says, attunement is important for a couple of reasons too, because if you're not attuned, I like mapping the room, by the way.
Okay.
I'm a big map the room person, who's engaged, who's not engaged, where's information coming from. But I think the attunement component was also interesting, because he said, wouldn't that be something if you spent all your time really trying to engage with Tiffany only to find out that she's not the one making the decision, right? And so making sure that you really do understand what's going on in the room and are very attuned to that, because there also may be some outside impact that just came into the room for some reason that you also want to be aware if you see some kind of shift. So I think the attunement of really being able to map that room and understand who's in the room and what's driving them, and really who is kind of the audience, I guess. And then being able to use that. And if you're listening and thinking, then you can take all that information in and use that to a positive result as well. I don't like saying to your advantage.
What's that?
I don't like saying the word to your advantage.
Well,
that kind of gets that smarmy thing again, right? And so it's not that, it's about that is valuable information to have as you're trying to determine the mutual gain. What is it that they're really looking for? And can you help that, make it happen?
And it's not just about empathy, and it's not about just the feelings, but it's really trying to attune to their thinking and what is really motivating the decision-making process to try to get to that. So help us just for a second, because you talk about mapping.
Yes.
He talks about mapping in the book. But for those of us that are here, maybe haven't read the book, can you quickly give an example or a demonstration? How do you do mapping, say in a particular meeting, or how does that work?
So I'm normally looking for, your perhaps, hopefully you've been very well prepared and there's a lovely agenda, and you present, what the outcome is, what is needed coming out of the meeting. And start to watch, you watch for the head nodding and things like that, right? So people who were engaged, people who could relate, you can start to, I think, from visuals, start to get where you already have some buy-in. You can also, I believe, pick up that lovely think side conversation. Starts to give you some indicators of who aligns with who. And start to pull from those individuals more and more information that you can ultimately use then to help shift the meeting towards hopefully a successful outcome for everyone. They tell you all the time, one of the, you hear all the time about watching for the people who aren't part of the discussion, how you get them engaged, and the one that's taken over the meeting. Those things are, I guess, fairly traditional things that people have you watch out for in meetings. But this is really almost about the social component as well, right? And so it's how the people are connecting. Who talks to who? How do they talk to that other person, right? So is it an acceptance component, or can you feel some kind of tension between them? Is there someone that no one talks to? Does there seem to be someone that everyone gravitates to as though they are looking for their approval or their decision, their input, because it must be the most important person in the room? And importance not tied to a label or a title, but rather the influence that they have within the group. And so to me, mapping and what do you call it, social cartography, is a very interesting dynamic, very interesting dynamic.
Well, and what you've sparked is my experience overseas and international, and we know that we've got some people who have watched this in the past. Hopefully, we've got some people watching today from an international perspective. But that idea of even in a bilingual environment, in a meeting type situation, it's really important that you come to an agreement as to what is going to be the common language of this meeting. nothing destroys a sense of mutual agreement more than to have a meeting in one language, but the side conversations in another. Because that really wreaks havoc on the sense of everybody being a part of the conversation,
Right.
especially if there's an awareness that not everybody speaks both languages. So to have some of those pieces, it really plays into the idea of culture and what the dynamics are around the room. And so yeah, that social cartography is fascinating stuff, but it's important to be able to utilize that with the attunement. So buoyancy. How do you stay afloat in the ocean of rejection? And that was actually a quote that he pulled from the last Fuller Brush salesman in San Francisco, and how he talks about the ocean of rejection and the things that he did to stay afloat. I heard, or actually read something just recently as well, that talks about the yes lives in the land of no's. So you have to be comfortable working and operating in that land of no's to find the yes, or to be comfortable in the ocean of rejection, because that's just becomes a part of, that's the environment. So what are some things that, you know, I imagine in your work, not everybody agreed with you and went exactly the way things, you know, you planned. So what are some things, or what are some tools that he talked about that you thought, oh, you know, I could have used that? Or maybe you looked at some of those different tools and were like, wow, I did that. I didn't realize this is actually affirming things that I've done in terms of just how you talked to yourself, or you even mentioned the introvert extrovert scale, the different pieces of how do you hold yourself up when it doesn't seem like you're really getting much of a yes.
Yeah. For me, I will openly admit that I can get one positive and I'm good for a while. And I can, an example is that we have a thing, we had at work a thing called second chance letters. So if somebody got in trouble, you know, they get a second chance, and it's probably somebody got in trouble, that we get to a second chance letter, because you're really talking about whether or not they're going to continue working for the organization. And to this day, the only ones I remember are the ones that went really well, right? Now, I know that it wasn't 100%.
Yeah.
I'm fully aware of that. But I also know that that's the reason that more people got second chance letters, because we had a positive come out of it, right? We changed, they have shared, you know, stories of changing things not only at work, but at home for them.
Yeah.
And so as long as you have that kind of energy that comes off of that, that allows you to say, you know what, I'm going to give, yeah, let's give another one, you know, let's give another. But they don't all work.
Yeah.
But it talks in the book about a number of things, right? It talks about the fact that the person who goes through that, I'm going to call it rejection. So the first time the person that I trusted and gave a second chance to, and it didn't work out, that's tough, right? Because I trusted the person. I had the conversations with them. And you know, that feeling of, it is a feeling of rejection, of being let down. But he talks about the fact that as long as you can understand that, you know what, it's not permanent. The next one could work. The next two could work. You know, it's all in how you take that negativity, really. Rejection is certainly negativity. It's all how you take that negativity in. If you let it paralyze you, then it will. But if you're able to say, you know what, this isn't permanent. You know what, I could have done something a little different here, you know, so take some responsibility on what you could be doing different in that situation. But your ability to pull those, and for me, it really is that the positive can keep me afloat for quite a while, I have to admit. Because it's also, it goes back to what I said in the very beginning. In my head, there's this piece about impact and influence. And to me, that was a way of having impact and influence, right? And so it feeds something very internal to myself. And so that's all I need. But it, you know, then it talked about, but don't go too far, right? Don't get so positive that you don't realize you're in the real world. And so there's so much positive, and there is going to be some negative. Just don't let it paralyze you. Don't let it be, don't think that it's permanent. It's temporary. And so, yeah, that whole that got me back to the whole positivity, and I said it earlier, Sean Aker, Positivity TED Talk, just because it's, I think it's 12 minutes. And it's just really quick, and he's very entertaining, but it's all about being bombarded day in and day out with negative to where we believe that's all there is, right? The news, breaking news alert. The breaking news alert is never positive. Right? Never. Breaking news alert means something bad happened today, and breaking news alerts seem to be every day. But that's not all that's going on in the world, you know. And so it's a very interesting dynamic, and so he automatically tied me back. I actually went and played the Sean Aker video because I had just read this book, so it brought me back to the positivity component and what that can bring to your life.
And that's a great, I mean, it's a great example of just even how we can work within those confines of feeling like things aren't going well, but when you can step back a second and literally begin to look and see, you know, kind of what he talks about, enumerate and embrace. It's, you know, realizing, oh my goodness, okay, so this was a good day. This one may not have been a great day, but phrasing it and looking at it so that you're not looking at it as, well, using these hyperbole type statements of, oh, I'm always bad at this. But it's like, you know, this wasn't my best day, but tomorrow's another day. And thinking about it and looking at it in that way. One of the pieces he talks about is this interrogative self-talk. Do you want to speak to that, or
Was that the Bob the Builder?
That's actually it was. Okay. It was about the Builder.
See, that's not me. Bob the Builder. Can I fix it? Yeah. I think that was an interesting dynamic because it isn't a practice that I necessarily feel I used. And so when you, like I said, as you're reading the book, you think, oh, wow, okay, there's something I could have tried. I think that it forces you to make a better plan, right? You know, sometimes the reason that we're not successful is we didn't do perhaps the kind of upfront component that we should have, or we didn't read the room, or whatever. And so I think it can force you, I think it talks about the fact that when you ask yourself that question, what it forces you to do is, number one, to respond. It forces perhaps the individual to respond if it's not with yourself. But with yourself, it forces you to respond. And then that, to an extent, forces you to plan and strategize, which makes you better prepared. So it was a very interesting dynamic, which, like I said, I don't know that I can say I used it necessarily. And so it was another component. We're like, oh, okay, so for the future, that's an interesting one.
Well, and just to kind of back up and give a little bit of premise, because you may be going, wow, where's this? This buoyancy piece, he talks about things that you do to prepare in advance for the talk. For your sales event, whatever that piece is, and then things that you do afterwards. And so this piece beforehand, a lot of times you would hear sales training that would say, just, get all the, and some of it is kind of really like super macho, you can do it, and all this kind of, and just, exactly, psych yourself up for the sale. And what he argues is the actually asking yourself, can you do this? That by presenting it as a question causes and allows your mind to begin to think creatively. So it's, can you do this? And why? And then you begin to go back through and you can, itemize the things, and you begin to get clarity over what are the things you can do, so that when you go into the meeting, you're actually prepared, because you've actually been pushing yourself and you have more clarity, as opposed to just psyching yourself up, which just kind of stops. So it is a twist on that. It's not just a statement. It is asking yourself questions about what is it that that really works, and why, and then going into that. And then the post event would be more of the enumerating, embracing, looking at things of saying, oh, well, that didn't go very well, but why? And try to be realistic about it. And understanding that you're going to have no's, and sometimes those no's may not necessarily be right now, but it's not yet. Or even maybe it's an actual offer for a negotiation. And then it's not just simply a flat no, but it's more of a, well, you've mentioned this, and this is where I was struck this as I was working on it. because I did just have recently a conversation where I made a proposal, and what came back was, well, we don't have the budget for that. And I just said, okay. And I was okay with that. I now look at that and I'm going, that was an offer. And I missed it. For that moment to be able to say, so can we talk about what would work with your budget? Or something of that nature, as opposed to just saying, okay, and accepting it and walking away. I am going to try to figure out if I can have a follow-up conversation. I will tell you that. But it is that part of the process of what does that do and how does that work so that we can, stay afloat and that buoyancy piece.
Well, buoyancy also, I think another thing that was, for me, I guess it starts to feel like common sense. By the way, I don't believe common sense. Every time I heard myself say, well, that's common sense, why don't they do that? Why don't they just do it? It's common sense. It's not common sense. It's that my experiences and what I've taken in have allowed me to move and act in certain ways that feel like common sense, but it's really that I've had an experience that perhaps they haven't. So I did learn that too. But it talks about buoyancy from levity and gravity, that you can't have one without the other and be buoyant.
Yeah.
And so that's where the whole positive and negative come into play, that levity, you're flying high, and gravity, you're going to be pulled back down to the earth, right? But they're saying to be buoyant, you do need some kind of balance of those two. So an all positive is not good, and certainly the all negative is not good, but you really do need both of them to actually deliver and be buoyant. And so that one was pretty, I guess you could see it, right? So it's one where it could be visible for you, as well as, boy, that does make sense, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yes.
As far as with the levity and that, believing in what you are marketing or what you are going out to talk about, to me is number one, that should be success in itself. And to be able to portray that to your, I don't like to use the word customer in what I do.
Or client or, yeah, right.
Anything that is, I want to offer this wonderful benefit to you because I believe in it because of this and so forth. Jill had brought up having those, I was picturing a board of directors, and the newer, younger person is coming in, the board of directors been in place 20 years, and you have a new idea, but they don't want to change, okay? It's at my side of what the things that I do is pre-notions or the negative of only what is seen with the words of the type of care we provide, and how it can be, and I don't want to use the word win-win now that I have the
Mutual gains.
the mutual
gains,
gains,
yes.
that I need to portray more out with my conversations. Because I have that is my job, conversations.
Yeah.
Every single day, inside, out, and so forth. So I think what it is those preconceived notions, having answers or ideas, suggestions that can be given to that person on why they have that preconceived notion. Meaning, well, why do you feel that way?
Yeah.
Well, this is what I've seen with so-and-so, and having not really an answer, but some type of solution of why I think it turned out that way. I'd like to believe common sense is still out there somewhere, but I've also seen, a lot of gravity when it comes to common sense, no real buoyancy. It just amazes me at times, like, what are you thinking?
Well, we're going to touch on that when we get to clarity. So,
Okay.
but no, go ahead.
But I think where my struggle is trying to break through the barriers, and mine are individualized from what everybody else does here in the room, of preconceived notions.
Sure.
And, do you have an out if you don't find what I'm telling you comes to fruition and so forth?
Yeah.
I'm right there at that toying, what is my comeback on being able to help them feel more at ease and so forth. But the whole idea of trying to change those notions is kind of where I get stuck.
Right.
Or the mud is muddling.
Yes.
And I've done this forever.
Yeah.
But every single time that I think about it, and as I'm going in, like you said, you're going in, you've got it planned, you know, I'm Jill the builder, I can do this, you know, and then I hear things by, you know, what preconceived notions and so forth, and I'm like, but I can tell you what it truly is, but does that matter? No, it was someone they believed in, told them this, and so forth. And I struggle with that every day.
That what's fascinating is one of the things that Daniel mentions in this book is that the education and medical fields, because of the tremendous growth in those particular industries, there is an enormous amount of sales, non-sales sales that takes place in that entire arena around the very thing that you're talking about, of just how do you bring about some potential knowledge and share that in a way that then fosters a change in their pattern of thinking. And so, Dan, did you want to speak to that, or I mean,
yeah,
be able to let you?
This kind of what I was going to ask about kind of goes along with what you were saying. You know, I think one of the interesting things that comes out in the book is the shift and why the sales approach has had to shift. That, you know, in the past, the salesperson, you had all the information, and now it's reversed, where the salesperson does not have all the information, the client does. You know, so that I think what you might be talking about is more managing that information for them.
Yes.
You know, and kind of picking out what is going to be more important and valid for them to make the best decision. So, you know, and I know we talked about that, you know, in the past, that you know, it used to be the salesman held all the cards because they had information the consumer did not have. You know, that has reversed today because everybody comes in as a client, patient, or whatever, and they have researched it, they've, you know, done their homework, and they often have more information than the salesman has. You know, they've become an immediate expert on this one particular thing. So,
And right or wrong.
yes.
Right. I mean, it was on the internet, it has to be right.
So, you know,
Especially
I think that concept,
Wikipedia.
and I don't know if we could talk about that a little bit, but that concept of, you know, it's no longer the selling necessary, that's necessarily important. It's helping them manage that information without telling them they're wrong or stupid, but say, you know, this is, so again, it comes back to listening where they are and how do I help them manage that information in such a way that gets them to make the best decision for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking to is this notion of a mental shift on our part as the salesperson, that we are not the problem solver, we're the problem finder. And it's the recognition that when we engage in a conversation, they may be feeling stuck in some way or form or fashion, or there's a pain that's there, whether it's a physical pain or an emotional pain or a mental, you know, always there's something there. So our job is to be the problem finder, to seek clarity, to ask those kind of questions and try to dig into a way that helps them understand with more clarity what they're actually needing. Because of the whole huge amount of information that's available, they're completely bombarded with all these different bits of information. And with all of that, we know there's a complete lack of clarity. And so the answer in many ways is not more options. The answer is a clear choice. And so being able to stick with that and find that niche or that itch or whatever that pain piece is. And so I think that may be part of what we're talking about, is it's for us as the person who is the salesperson, shifting from coming in and saying, well, I'm going to solve your problems, to saying, I recognize that there's something going on here, and let me help you find what that problem is, and then we can discuss how we're going to address it.
And I should clarify, the common sense is in my personal side of my life,
Sure.
not my, not the people that I speak to on a daily basis.
Right, sure.
Because everyone has their own thoughts in that respect.
Yes,
I
yeah.
do not claim to be any kind of clarifier.
Yeah, no,
clarification.
that's great. That question from online,
Yeah.
or statement, or something.
Yeah, question. So this person wants to know which part of ABC is managing expectations. I have clients who want the systems we sell to operate for a long time, 10 plus years.
Okay,
That's what it says.
okay. So I wonder, wow, I've got other questions I would love to clarify that, but that may be the actual C, which is the clarifying. And so we'll call that a good segue. And please, whoever that is, please, if we're not answering that question, please ping us back and give us a little more feedback so we can make sure that we're, trying to address that. But the clarity piece is the C of the ABCs. And it's the idea that and it just kind of what I was just saying, going from that problem solving to being problem finding, and then looking at ways to have some strategies to implement with that. So one of them is this motivational interviewing, which becomes, there are a number of different strategies there, but there are things that you can do where you just keep asking questions. One group encourages what they call the 5 whys, which literally is, and it may sound annoying, but why? And when the person answers that question, so why? And it sometimes will take 5 full whys to really get more clarity as to what's actually needed. So that's one way to be able to do that. There are other ways to begin, and kind of, a lot of it really comes around seeking the best ways to ask questions. And sometimes it's what type questions, or maybe a when type question. Daniel Pink, this is a whole other plug. I haven't read it yet, but he's written another book since this one called When. And he looks at the scientific process of when decisions should be made. And so he really kind of digs into some of these different things. Fascinating author.
I think the C works too, because it talks about, at least in the book, it talked about the fact, because they mentioned the 10 years, and it talks about having the ability to help them see things in a fresh and new way, right? And so maybe they have problems, they have issues they don't even know they have, and maybe they're trying to solve something that really isn't what, because it's problem finding, it's not really what needs to be solved. And so I think the clarity component, but I also thought maybe starting a little bit with attunement, to ensure that really are matched up in what's going on. And then I do think when the question first came up, I thought clarity, but there could also be a component of attunement there as well.
Well, the A and C really, I think, are almost like they're the opposite sides of the same coin. The buoyancy kind of speaks to just how do we stay afloat, how do we, but the A and C are really, really close together, where there's the attunement piece, but then there's also the job that we have to try to seek and find that level of clarity. Another way of seeking clarity is a comparison piece, kind of like what we talked about earlier. How do you frame that conversation so that okay, so you're thinking this as compared to what? So if you're thinking, okay, 10-year plus whatever this might be, as compared to what? So that may be another option to look at.
I will steal shamelessly from the organization that came from in the sales department. And they worked with some outside organization and developed selling with beer. And what it really did is it allowed and under the traditional sales titles, it allowed individuals to go into retailers and actually share tremendous amounts of data about that, because the retailer is saying, look, you people in the beer industry are crazy. You're driving us crazy because we can't keep up with how many different brands, and we got the craft and we got the domestics, and we don't have that much shelf space. The shelf space is the shelf space, right? And so you guys just got to back off. What's in here is it. And so to try and get maybe a fresh look at all of that, what could really help their business? How could they sell more? Not just beer. How could they sell more groceries? How could they sell more gourmet, ready-to-go meals? How could they do that? And so they started to, number one, they started to look at how the shelf space was the shelf space. So how do they do setups? How do they do sets? But they included the competitors in the sets, right? So immediately it takes away from, well, you're just here to see what you can do for yourself, right? Took away from that component to say, well, wait a second, they got the craft guy in here, they got the other big guy, what's going on here, right? Probably got them suspicious, I guess. And then they went into the grocery cart data and said, what happens when an individual buys a 6-pack of beer, what else do they buy? And how can you start to do companion sales? How can you start to drive more? You've all probably heard of something called the loss leader, right? You don't want to be the loss leader, but sometimes that's the right thing to do, right? But they shared tremendous amounts of information. And when they were able to show the retailer that, oh my gosh, if I do this one thing, I can now increase my total grocery sales, not just the beer sale, my total grocery sales. So when you start to include your competitors' data, when you start to look at the problem differently and help them get to a different view of what might be going on, that their real problem wasn't that they didn't have enough shelf space or anything that was going on. The real problem was we have to take some responsibility, not doing a good job of matching things up so that you could show them exactly what was selling for them, so that you could show them what was a companion sale for something else almost every single time. And so it was that kind of information that started to drive, and we get testimonies all the time about that tool that was developed and how much it did for the retailer, not just on beer sales, but in sales in total. And now all of a sudden, right now they trust you more. Now they allow you to actually reset the entire shelf, not just your product, but everybody's product, because they trust you and believe that you're actually looking at what's best for their business, not just what's best for you.
What's interesting is he makes this connection between irritation versus agitation, and it kind of speaks to this. The irritation would be if you're the buyer, and somebody comes in and they just keep hammering. Well, you just gotta give us more shelf space. You gotta give us more space. Carry my stuff. And that just becomes irritating for the buyer. They're gonna stop at some point, right. Or they're just gonna be like, I'm done, right? Versus agitation, right? Which is an interesting twist on that, because what happens is when you come in and you start saying, okay, let's look at all the shelf space. Let's bring in these other people and help you see where you can actually improve all these things. The agitation becomes in their own recognition. Oh, I need this. They get fidgety and agitated because they've actually begun to recognize, I need to make this decision because this is going to help me, versus I don't want to talk to anybody because I'm irritated by all the, so it's a irritation versus agitation. Are we close to? Can you read that question again? I want to make sure.
They actually responded that we answered their question.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ooh, yeah, all right. So any other thoughts or comments on that piece? I'm very conscious of time, so I want to make sure that we are touching on a couple other things just real quick as we're wrapping up. But any comments or thoughts? I don't want to leave anybody behind either, so. Going once, going twice. Okay, the concept of rising above the elevator pitch. The elevator pitch has been the long time, sales thing. If you're going to do anything, if you're going to be at a networking event, if you're going to be at a chamber event, if you're going to be, stuck in an elevator for 30 seconds with the person that you need to talk to, what are you going to say? And that becomes the big piece of, how do you do that? What Daniel Pink talks about in the book is that the pitch needs to actually be different now. And so he recommends or suggests or offers 6 different pitches to rise above the elevator pitch. I think he actually says the 6 successors.
Right.
I chose the word rising up because it seemed to work with an elevator better than successive. But he uses these 6 different pitches. One is just the one-word pitch. For example, if I begin talking about anything in finance but the word priceless, what comes to mind?
Credit card.
And is there a specific credit card that comes to mind?
MasterCard.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, what's another one? If you're in the tech realm and you talk about search, I think you actually used the word earlier that has now become synonymous with search. If there's one word that defines your business, your service, the work that you do, what is it? And he literally, he encourages, start by writing a 50-word and then cut it out and go down to 25 words and narrow it down to what is the one word that defines what you offer, what you do, who you are. Another one is the question pitch, is framing it in a question of just, you know, rather than having it always being a statement, but asking it as a question. The rhyming pitch. This is my favorite is the gummy bear company Haribo from Germany. They have yeah, you're seeing a little squishy.
The commercials.
Okay. Another side note, you know, they've got huge ones too. Do you know that? Oh my goodness. Anyway, so but Haribo literally does a rhyme. Some of their ad campaigns, they have a rhyme in every different language where they advertise and market their material. So what they write in English is completely different than what they would write in French or Spanish or German or whatever else, because they focus on the rhyme, because they know that that's a connection, that's a pitch. A subject line pitch. What is something that you could throw out in an email and test that? And it, you know, may not always be the short and pithy, but maybe it's you know, I mean, what do we call it now? Clickbait. You know, the thing that you see on social media or on Facebook that is the 13 ways or the 15 or 17 ways or the 9 ways or, you know, the 10.5 ways to what, you know, there's always some seemingly number and list that seems to go well with that. The Twitter pitch, something where you've got a set amount of words. And then the Pixar pitch, which was a unique one, but he basically used the model of any Pixar movie, and you see kind of a set formula in there. And so that's what he encourages to think about, and literally taking your business, your service, your whatever you're selling, and run it through all of these different pitches, because you may use different ones at different times, not just to be stuck on one particular one.
I thought what was kind of, I'll call it fun. What was kind of interesting is that he actually took the Pixar pitch and put it to the book. So if he was trying to pitch the book and use the Pixar pitch, what would that sound like? And so he actually, so I will emphasize perhaps the once upon a time, only some people were in sales. Every day they sold stuff, we did stuff, and everyone was happy. One day, everything changed. All of us ended up in sales, and sales changed from a world of caveat emptor to caveat emptor.
Buyer beware to seller beware.
Because of that, we had to learn the new ABCs: attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. Because of that, we had to learn some new skills to pitch, to improvise, and to serve. Until finally, we realized that selling isn't some grim accommodation to a brutal marketplace culture. It's part of who we are, and therefore something we can do better by being more human. So it's the once upon a time, every day, one day, because of that, until finally. And so he actually uses his own pitch work and applies it to pitch in the book, which I thought was pretty interesting.
And it's a great way. He literally in that process then spells out the idea of the pitch, the improvise. I think, well, I was going to say convicted, but I'm not sure that's the right word. But yes, there is I want to be better at improvising. I'm a very deliberative person. And so I want to be better at improvising, and that's one of the pieces he talks about in there. And the last one is the idea of genuine service, and it's serving. And he says, rather than upsell, the minute you feel inclined to upsell, stop. Don't upsell. He encourages you to think about upserving. What can you do to serve and increase the experience of the other individual so that they feel better about themselves and they feel better about the whole process?
He talks about making it personal and making it purposeful. That's the serve part. And he does use some examples of the Italian restaurant in Washington, D.C. And there's the individual, the owner, has put up his picture with his phone number and says, if you didn't have a great experience, I want you to call me and tell me. And not surprising, they say, when he talked to the owner, he said he does get a lot of calls about positive stuff. It's not that he doesn't want those, but he doesn't want those. He wants the negative calls so that he can do something better if they did not have the kind of experience he was hoping. So that made it personal, that he would put his cell phone number on there for them to contact him personally. You hear it all the time that, if you're in an organization where a true open door policy, right? Where truly you can go in and you can see the individual and don't have to be knocking on doors. People were surprised, both the distributors, retailers, and perhaps some of my employees. My business card had all of my phone numbers on it. It had my home phone number on it. It had my cell phone number on it. Because if it was that important enough for them to call me at home, I had to figure out why it was that important enough for them to want to call me. Because usually you don't call the boss at home. And I don't like that word boss either, but that's a whole other book. And so I think those are the kinds of things, making it personal and then making it purposeful was pretty important in the serve component.
Yeah.
I also want to say, I think I just want to step back because I think it could apply, Jill, in some respects on the clarity component that we talked about. He's also make sure that we understand that it's not enough to find the right problem, but he calls it the off-ramp, finding the right off-ramp. If all we do is identify the right problem and share that with the individual without helping them strategize how they're going to change that, they may not move. They may stay unmoved. And we talked about, one of the biggest things today about the change in the non-sales seller is the ability to move, whether it's people, organizations, whatever, your product. And so if you don't help them actually find the off-ramp, they can get stuck. And so it's not enough to just help them find what the real problem is. It's also about helping them strategize the off-ramp and how they're going to correct it.
Any thoughts or comments? Anything from online? Okay, this is a beautiful off-ramp.
There we go.
Because right here at the end is my question to you. What are your takeaways? And what is your action step? I ask this every time, and I even encourage you to think about this. Take a minute or two and write down, what are your light bulb moments? Just 2 of them. 2 light bulb moments or insights that you picked up from our conversation today. And then what action step do you recognize that you need to do differently? What is that action step? Write it down. What is that action step and what is the step? And give it specificity. Make it specific, make it tangible, and make it soon. Put a date to it and do it within the next few days, if not a week. And then take that first step to making your company, your life, your organization more profitable. That's the off-ramp, is find that specific step to move forward. Don't just sit here and go, oh, well, okay, that's great. I feel some of the pain. We found the issue. But literally begin to think through what's the next step. How do we do that? And finally, I would love to hear those insights. This is a big part of what I do, is I love to be able to help find those problems and then help you begin to navigate and map out your next steps and the success for you moving forward. And I realize that even with the best of intentions, even with those best of intentions, we're going to leave here, and I think I already heard somebody's phone buzzing. We're going to have phone calls. We're going to have emails. We're going to have all those things that pop back up, and they will distract us and take us away from the very things that we truly intend to make different right now. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a challenge and a little bit of a press, and that is, in the next 3 hours, email your insights or your action step, actually both. I'd love to, what are your insights? What did you learn from today? Or what are your action steps? What is that action step? Email that to me and I'll respond to you in the next day. I'll send you a link where you can then sign up for and just register at a time that's convenient for you for a scheduled coaching session with me. And I would love to be able to help you take that action step and literally build on that for the next set of steps and give you a tangible plan moving forward after the cutoff. So that's for 3 hours. We're almost at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. So 3 hours. Send that to me and I'll send you a link, and we'd love to schedule an appointment. If it's after the 3 hours, that's fine. Please do that. Send it to me. I'd love to hear it as well. But at that point, after those 3 hours, here's the little catch. I'll have to charge you my normal first time or one-time coaching rate of $500. So there's your catch. Do it within the next 3 hours, and I'd love to be able to talk with you. Either way, I hope you have been able to gather a few things, collect a few things that will be helpful for you. And Denise, thank you. Really appreciate the chance to have you and to be able to have the conversation with this and from your perspective and background, how that's worked for you. And for all of you that are watching either online or here in person, thanks so much for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.